Chapter 2 Pierre's Plan. On Monday morning, Pierre visited with his father before he left for school. Pierre sat carefully down beside him. You know, Pierre said, this wouldn't have happened if I'd been. Father interrupted him. It's not your fault I chopped off my thumb, he said, scowling at the heavy bandage in disgust. Short, dark, and always energetic, Father was never one to hide his feelings. His voice resounded with conviction, the same voice that loved to sing and tell stories. Pierre stared at the wrapped thumb, imagining the stub and its stitched flap of skin. What he wanted to say was, "Tell the truth, Father. Tell how my laziness has crippled you." "You'll not hear this Hyvernaut complain about anything but his own clumsiness," Pierre's father continued. "Why, I was wielding an axe when I was half your size. But if I'll hear none of it, and I'll thank you to not manufacture excuses for me. I'm old enough to know the difference between a stick of wood and my thumb." As Pierre left the bedroom, he heard the nervous whispers of his mother and his sister. He knew what they were talking about. His father was scheduled to sign his engagement papers with the Northwest Company this very week. Like most of the men in Lachine, Canada, Pierre's father was a voyager who freighted goods from Montreal to Grand Portage. We knew the Ottawa River system and the Great Lakes as well as any man alive, and the canoes he guided were famous for their speed. If father couldn't sign on, Camille, who was already 17, could work as a maid or housekeeper to help the family survive. They might manage if mother could do the same, but she needed to take care of Pierre's baby sister Claire. When Pierre sat down to breakfast, Camille asked, "Are you all right?" He ignored her, hating the way she babied him lately. Since she'd gotten an engagement ring last Christmas from a Montreal boy, it was as if he had two mothers. She was always ordering him around, and to make matters worse, she had a loud voice like father's. Even a casual comment sounded irritatingly bossy. Pierre couldn't wait until she married next summer and moved into a house of her own. As he ate, Pierre watched little Claire tug at Camille's hair ribbon. Though Claire had spent the first 6 months of her life crying, she was smiling a lot lately. Last week, she even pointed at Pierre and said, "Bah," a word he proudly insisted meant brother. If this baby had to go hungry because of him, Pierre would never forgive himself. But what could he do? After breakfast, Pierre left for school. Pierre's mother insisted he go to school, even though most of his friends had left the schoolroom and gone to work. Like father, mother wasn't shy about her opinions. She'd always told her son that he would be a great man someday. She hoped he would become a judge, a merchant, or even a priest, but Pierre didn't care to look that far ahead. School had always been easy for Pierre, but now that he was 13 and the oldest boy still enrolled, he was bored. Sister Marguerite tried to make things more interesting by having him tutor the younger students, but tutoring was dull compared with the stories his working friends told of their lives as canoemen, lumberjacks, and apprentice tradesmen. He was tired of being a mere schoolboy. When everyone else had entered the real world, they were driving wagons and piloting riverboats and voyaging in canoes, while he was stuck memorizing Latin verbs. This morning, though, he told no one of his plan. He walked straight past his school to the waterfront district and the main depot of the Northwest Company. The riverbank was crowded with at least 12 dozen men. The voyageurs were dressed in red caps, short shirts tied with bright sashes, breechclouts, deerskin leggings, and moccasins. They were all busy packing trade goods or working on their canoes. Pierre felt nervous and out of place. He'd never stayed away from school before, and he worried about what his mother would think. During breakfast, when he'd planned this trip in his mind, he thought it would be easy to find a company clerk or one of his father's friends, but he had no idea where to begin in this maze of men. He walked over to a fellow who was holding a torch in one hand and dripping a ball of pitch into the seams of a canoe. Pierre tapped the man on the shoulder. "Excuse me, sir, could—" The man stood up and growled, "What do you want with Belgrade?" Pierre quickly drew back. This was the ugliest man he'd ever seen. The man's hair was thin and scraggly. One of his earlobes was missing, and the left side of his face was pushed toward the center. White scars ran along his cheek and nose, in stark relief against his dark face. Could you tell me?" The fumes from the torch burned Pierre's eyes. He coughed. The Voyager threw back his head and laughed. One front tooth was missing. You used to prettier men than Andre Bellegarde, he said. But I tell you, I'm best looking fellow you'll ever see who wrestled the grizzly bear and lost. One swipe to the head, he pointed to the jagged scars with the warm pitch block in his hand, is all it took to make this mess. Pierre could think of nothing to say. I'm sorry. Save your pity for the dead, boy. Belgrade spat into the sand at Pierre's feet. Besides, the bear's worse off than me. He rattled the bear claw necklace that hung down the front of the leather shirt. Don't never be sorry for no man what's still alive. Pierre stared at the bear claws, as huge as a man's fingers, and his eyes widened. Please, I'm looking for your brigade chief. McKay? The man said, pointing with his torch toward a long storehouse just up the riverbank. For a moment, Pierre thought about heading back to the schoolhouse. He liked to go slowly, to consider every option, but he could tell that these men plunged headlong into their work as he walked cautiously up the bank. Men hurried by on all sides, carrying bundles of trade goods and laughing and whistling. One man with a powder keg on each shoulder called out, Step aside, boy. These casks got more bite than you'd care to handle. This was the company his father kept, dark-skinned, with heavily muscled arms and shoulders. Each man carried 2 90-pound bales of cargo on his back. A few swaggering fellows hauled 3 parcels without complaint. As Pierre studied the men, he recalled the first time his father brought him down to this landing. He was only 7 or 8. One of the last brigades of the season was just arriving. The father hoisted him on his shoulder so he could see over the gathering crowd. Pierre counted 24 canoes. It's the biggest brigade of the year, father said. Then he whispered, There's more than $1 million worth of pelts in those canoes. Not bad for a single season of fur trade with the Indians, eh? $1 million, Pierre repeated. Yes, father nodded, and the lot of it paddled and portaged more than 1,000 miles from Grand Portage just so gentlemen can wear beaver pelt hats. Hats? Pierre looked at his father's simple red cap. Beaver hats this tall, father said, raising his hand to an absurd height above his head, for fancy gents to wear when they walk with fancy ladies. When Pierre reached the top of the riverbank, there was no mistaking Commander McKay. He stood half a head taller than any of the men clustered around him. Bushy red hair covered his face and ringed his balding head, and he was dressed more like a banker than a frontiersman. An unlit briar pipe stuck out of his vest pocket. A pencil stub was tucked behind one ear. He was deep in conversation with another man. When McKay finally noticed Pierre, he stopped. What'll it be, laddie? I've come to engage, sir, Pierre said. Bit young, aren't ye? Pierre lied. I'm nearly 14. He had just turned 13 the month before, but at 5 feet 5 inches and 130 pounds, he was confident he could work of a man, though he knew his boyish face and cropped hair made him look young. Sorry, but we don't have time to play nursemaid. Our trips are a hard push all the way. McKay looked again at his list. Pierre's face reddened as he struggled to think of a reply. He knew McKay wouldn't care that he could spell well or that he'd won Sister's geography prize 3 years in a row. He hated himself for his shyness. Why couldn't he be loud and bold like his father? Finally he said, I can paddle hard. I really can. My father, Charles LePage, has worked for the Northwest Company since he was 12. That's all well and good, McKay replied, without looking up, but it's steersmen we need, lad. We've middlemen enough to paddle us clear to China. Pierre thought of little Claire and the hard winter this family would face without father's wages. He had to think of something. But before he could speak again, a voice spoke up. Pardon me, Mr. McKay. A thin, light-skinned man with gray eyes strolled up to Pierre. Did you say you were Charles LePage's son? Yes, I am. Stepping closer to Pierre, the man stopped and stared. Suddenly he made a fist and touched it to the tip of Pierre's chin. His rock-hard knuckles tilted Pierre's head back. The fellow grinned and clapped Pierre on the shoulder, nearly knocking him over. That blonde hair could have fooled me, but you've got Charlie's firm jaw, square-like, with that little hollow. Can you take a punch like your pa? The man held up his fist again and grinned. McKay looked up. You and this LePage fellow, mates, Carbonneau. We wintered together. up at Athabasca. If he's Charlie's son, I'll vouch for him. You sure? I could use one more middleman in my canoe. That's fine with me, but you see through it. Yes, sir. Charbonneau touched his cap. I will, sir. Though Pierre was grateful to Charbonneau for helping, the man's pushy military manner made Pierre nervous. Pierre's father made fun of soldiers. He called them silly saluters who loved to play dress-up, and Charbonneau seemed to be that type. Without any word, McKay drew out an official-looking piece of parchment. He lifted the glass stopper from his inkwell and dipped in his goose quill pen. Writing in bold script, McKay filled in Pierre's engagement papers with the date, May 11, 1800, and his full name. McKay then handed the pen to Pierre. When Pierre signed his name to the contract and didn't just make an X like most of the men, McKay said, "What do you think of that, Charbonneau? Any lad who writes such a strong hand should be a fine paddler." Charbonneau made no comment. He frowned at the fancy writing on the contract. Next, while McKay checked each item off on a list, Charbonneau issued Pierre the standard Northwest Company supplies: a blanket, a shirt, a pair of trousers, 2 handkerchiefs, and a 2-pound twist of carrot tobacco. When Charbonneau counted out the 1/3 advance on a year's salary, Pierre felt proud, knowing he'd done the right thing. McKay then concluded Pierre's engagement by shaking his hand and saying, "Just make sure you stay clear of those Hudson's Bay rascals." Knowing how much the Northwest men hated their arch rival, the Hudson's Bay Company, Pierre quickly said, "I will, sir." McKay then turned to Charbonneau. "Have him work with La Petite today. That should keep him busy." Charbonneau nodded with a wry smile and marched around the table toward a long storehouse. Charbonneau was long-legged and lean compared to the other voyageurs. His quick movements reminded Pierre of Monsieur Marlot, a man who owned a combined livery stable and funeral parlor in La Seine. Charbonneau had the same sort of thin face, all sharp points and angles. Pierre had to walk fast to keep up. He wondered what sort of a fellow this little La Petite might be. Just before they passed through the low doorway of the storehouse, McKay called after them, "Make sure La Petite has secured that last Montreal canoe." Charbonneau turned and acknowledged McKay's command. "Aye, sir, and tell him to make sure he's cocked up tight. The last we hired from him, that scoundrel Loglois, leaked like a rotten thatch job." With one last eye, Charbonneau led Pierre into the storeroom. The only light inside was cast by an oil lamp. Pierre had never seen such vast piles of goods. Bolts of calico cloth and ribbon and crates crammed with bells and colored beads and mirrors and sewing materials were piled on shelves that lined either wall. Stacked around the room were other boxes that held spears, ice chisels, and gaff hooks for trapping beaver during the winter. Kegs and nested copper kettles were stacked near the entry, and thought of hauling all these trades goods the length of the Great Lakes suddenly made Pierre uneasy. Anyone can sign his name and pocket his salary, he thought, but what about portaging cooking pots and musket balls and 35-foot lake canoes? "La Petite," Charbonneau called, squinting into the half-dark. "Where's that fellow gone now?" he mumbled. "La Petite," Charbonneau tried again, stepping forward and calling twice as loudly. Out of the corner of his eye, Pierre thought he saw a dim shadow, but before he could turn, 2 hands seized his ankles from behind and suddenly jerked his feet out from under him. "Ee!" Pierre threw out his hands to keep his face from smashing into the dirt floor. An instant later, he was swinging upside down, staring at the largest pair of moccasins he had ever seen. "Let me go!" Pierre yelled. Someone laughed uproariously. "So what have you brought me, Charbonneau? Something to shelve or to stick in a nice little keg?" Charbonneau laughed as little La Petite swung Pierre up toward the rafters and let go of his ankles. Pierre squealed again, thinking of a moment that this giant intended to kill him, but La Petite caught the boy by his armpits just as he began to fall and set him back down.